Would you like to learn how to create a simple winter watercolor landscape in just a few minutes? Some water, and what I'm going to do is just get a little bit of it on the brush here, and then I'm just going to spatter. Trying not to make the spatters too large. Small snowflakes, big snowflakes, and I'm not trying to get too much of patterns here. If it is too much, if it's too large, that spot there, I could just wait for that to dry in a few minutes and peel that off. So put down some spatters where the snow is going to be, and then we have to let that dry 1000%. Make sure to rinse off your brush when you're done using the masking fluid, because this is liquid latex, and if it dries in the brush, it's going to kill it very, very quickly. So rinse it off with water. So I'm going to just take some color on my palette, because I always have just a bunch of just random colors on my palette, a lot of grays. That's what I use all my grays for. I keep just a bunch of, never throw colors away. I just dry it out in the palette again. And so I'm going to make this kind of a bluish gray. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into here, and I'm going to put down something for the background. So I don't want this to be too dark though. And watercolor is one of those hard things because you know it's going to dry a lot lighter than it looks. So if you think it's too dark, you're probably okay. Throw a little bit more green into this. Now, it looked pretty dark when I put that down there, but I don't think that's going to be. I'm just going to let that spread out a little bit. Take some cerulean blue. And I will include links for all the colors in the video description, so if you want to get these online, you're welcome to. All right. And so my tape, painting just popped off the tape, which is why I'm holding it down here now. I do have a piece of blue tape, which is supposed to be sticking to, but it wasn't. It's being difficult on me. And just make sure you get to the edge of the painting. And then what you also have to do too is the water that gets underneath the painting when you're working on boards, you've got to clean that up because that's going to turn into big water blossoms later. So get your paper towel underneath that and soak that up. This paper will dry flat because we don't have big puddles in certain areas. But then while it's still wet, what I want to do is I want to get a little bit of texture, because we're working with forests and we're getting a lot of texture in the background anyways. I'm going to flip a little bit of water into this. You could throw a little bit of salt down here if you want to. Or what you can do, which I love to do, is instead of using salt, and yes, I just spit in my painting. And then what you have to do is you've got to give that a little bit of time for it to do its effect. I'm trying to push this down on a piece of tape now. This will leave a dark mark where I do that. And I'm just analyzing to see if this is where I want. So I've got a nice wash across this whole sky. It's about the same value. There's a mixture of different colors in here. I think that's pretty good so far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop. I'm going to let that dry. I'm not going to use a hairdryer on this though, because I want the salt effects to take effect and the water to take effect too. You could drop water on here too as it continues to dry and get some further blossoming and textural effects. You could flip water into it. You could lift out some color if you want to while things are still wet. And if you want to lift color, what you want to do is you want to take a thirsty brush, so your brush now becomes drier than the paper. If it's drier than the paper, what it's going to do is it's going to wick up color as opposed to putting it down. So you could pick up some shapes if you wanted to. Just pull out a little bit of that. Don't want to do too much. Very gently pull out some color, just to create a little bit more variety in the background. Could wake up a little bit here. There's some water in here. We just want it to look like a forest. All right, so now as this is starting to get its effects, what I want to do now is I want to start making it look like there's trees in the background here. And in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here with thicker paint and less water. And even though the paper is still wet, if we're working with thicker paint, less water, it's not going to move as much. And so what I'm going to do is, and it's going to spread out quite a bit, and it's going to look very different in 5 minutes. So when you put down this darker color, you're going to think it's way too much at first. But in 10 minutes, it's going to lighten up a lot. What this does is it starts to create an effect of atmospheric perspective. So darker things come forward. Lighter things with less contrast go into the background. And it just starts to make it look almost three-dimensional. So the paper's starting to dry right there a little bit, so I'm getting kind of a hard edge. I'm taking just a mixture of all the grays on my palette. Just dropping down some shapes. We're just trying to make it look like foliage, so there isn't a pattern. Do the same thing here. I am using a Richeson Silver Velvet brush in number 8, which has nice tips and points on them, so I can get, they hold a lot of paint too. And I'll also include a link to that in the video description. They're not too expensive either. I buy a new set every year, because the tips don't last forever, unfortunately. Especially because I paint like Conan the Barbarian. Me, Conan. Or I have the brushwork skills, I should say, of Conan the Barbarian. All right, so let's grab some just more grays here. Again, this is just a mixture of whatever I have dried on my palette, which is just about everything. So if you're really trying to find out exactly what color it is, I really have no idea. Just something a little bit darker. Just making little evergreen shapes here. Let's grab some different color over here. Yeah, I'm notoriously cheap. I don't know if I call it cheap. Let's say frugal. I hate throwing stuff away. So if I can reuse something again, the colors at the bottom of my palette, I do it, you know, or colors at the bottom of my water bucket. You can get all that sludge out of there and keep it, save it for later. So what my kid would say about dinner, which means he's not going to eat it. Saving it for later, like, no, you're not. So up here I'm getting a hard edge because the paper's starting to dry on me. So now what I'm continuing to do is I'm just continuing to work on this. As this painting's drying on me a little bit, coming back in, thicker paint, less water, and it will start to look three-dimensional. You just can't do too much, and try not to go back into things either, because that has a tendency to pull off all that color you've put down there. So that's gonna look, that's coming forward a little bit more. And what you can't see, and what the hard part about this is that the masking fluid has preserved the white of the paper, but you can't see that because it's the blue-green stuff. This is the Pebeo brand, which is a good masking fluid. It seems to hold up for a long time. The Turner one is one I've recently discovered. That's a new one that my art supply store carries. So I have to see how long that stays good. Masking fluid doesn't last forever in the bottles. If you've had it for a couple years, it's probably not good. Always test it on your paper beforehand, because sometimes you can't get it out of the paper if it's too old or if it's gotten really hot or something. So I'm just grabbing a bunch of, now I'm just getting darker color. And you see how we're starting to get a little bit of a sense of depth in this painting? Even though things are still really, really wet. And if I come up into here now with thicker paint, less water, this isn't gonna move as much. And it's gonna start to create this effect of atmospheric perspective. That's the goal anyways. Okay, so we're doing these trees over here. I'm not looking at any sort of a reference image. I'm just making this up and having fun. That's, for me, when, you know, I usually work from photographs, but then I do find that when people work from photographs, especially beginners, they have a tendency to get too tight and they want to recreate the photograph. And that's when hopefully me as a teacher is there to say, hey, look, this is art. We can make it whatever we want. You don't have to make it look like the photograph. We're trying to make it look like a watercolor painting of trees. So don't stress too much about all the fine details. And, you know, little things that happen, AKA mistakes, don't stress about that too much either, because you're going to make lots of mistakes. And if you, I think, freak out about the mistakes, especially at the very beginning of the painting, you're probably going to ruin the piece. But if you keep going with it, you'll probably be okay, because there's always mistakes. And now thicker paint, less water. And you're going to see this is really starting to sit on the top of the surface now. And I'm just using just a random mixture of whatever is on top of my palette. But I don't use black. I use almost always, well, I take that back. I do use black sometimes for certain effects, but I like to mix my colors up so that if I do darks, the darks have a lot of variety of colors, and those colors separate in the paper. As one color soaks into the paper, another one sits on top, and you can really start to see this beautiful depth. And that's one of the things I love about watercolor, and I think is unique to the medium. I am a little biased, of course, because I don't do anything else but watercolor. So you can see here now, I'm coming into here with this thicker paint, less water. And I'll keep saying that because it's super important. And on my palette, I'm just making sure it doesn't look as wet and puddly as when I first started. I've got oops, I got some pure red right there. I gotta soak that up with a thirsty brush. And let's grab some more greens. And if you're trying to make a nice gray, if you got a super clean palette, you want to make a nice gray, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue will make a very granulating, nice dark color. And you can lean that towards the blue side or the red side, however you want. So you see here, this is getting darker now. And let's make a little tree shape over here. I'm trying to make sure that the trees I'm doing are not evenly spaced. So if I start to realize I'm creating patterns, I have to stop that. Because the only time you see patterns in nature really are when you're in subdivisions or driving on the highway and they planted trees, equally 10 feet apart. But that's not the way forests look, with the squirrels forget where they put the nuts, the birds poop them out, they go all over the place. So there shouldn't be too much of an order. So if you realize you're doing things that are like an inch apart, break it up a little bit. Some hard edges, some soft edges. I'm now gonna start taking out, I don't like what I just did there. So I'm gonna wick up with a thirsty brush. So the brush is drier than the paper. And what it does now is it picks the color up as opposed to putting it down on the paper. Grabbing some more green and brown. There's lots of ways to make good greens. Opposites on the color wheel will do it. All right, now the paper up here you can see visually looks dry. This looks wet. And now if I come up into here, I'm gonna grab even a smaller brush. This is a number 6 Richeson Silver Velvet, which is also a great brush too. I buy another one of these. I buy a new set of these guys every year. And I'm gonna come into here. I have to keep my hand out of wet paint. That's the hard part about doing this. If I come up into here, you're gonna see that now I'm getting hard edges because the paper is mostly dry. So we'll make our little tree here and make this a little bit more green. I'll have some areas. So go back and forth, just make tree shapes. And where I get into the wet paper, we're gonna have some soft edges. But now we're starting to get to the point where the painting is becoming a combination of hard edges and soft edges. And this to me is what's great about watercolor. And I don't think you can get this with other mediums. All right, let's make another tree shape up here. This guy's leaning over a little bit too. Don't have the trees go straight up. If you look at nature, you're gonna realize that trees don't all stand up straight. Limbs aren't symmetrical, because that's how kids draw trees. It's not what it looks like. All right, getting down to some darker shapes here. But there's a lot of variety within the color here. And getting some darker spots. Remember, it's always about controlling the water in the paint on the paper, and it does take practice. If things look wet, you're not gonna get a hard edge. You're gonna get a soft edge. If the paper looks dry as it does up in here, you're gonna get soft edges. And I'm already starting to get a sense of depth in this painting. So now I'm working with thicker paint, less water. I'm gonna put some darker shapes into here. Paper is starting to dry at the bottom here, so I'm getting hard edges. You want to soften out a little bit, come back in with a wet brush and touch those edges, let them spread out a little bit. The paper is slightly damp still, so it's pretty easy to get hard and soft edges all over the place. And I'm continuing to work on some darker shapes. I'm using thick paint, less water. Coming back into this area here, so this paper is mostly dry here. I'm kind of using this nice brush. See, I'm getting hard edges up in here. And you can see that even though this is wet now in this section, the paint isn't moving as much because it's really thick paint. And I'll put down some blobs where I want shapes to be. I'm going to come up into here and make the top of this tree. This paper is dry here now, so this will give me a hard edge. Change the color temperature up. Make it a little bit more green. Always change the color temperature. Don't keep it the same the whole time, that's boring. It does take a long time to figure that out. So I have big puddles on my palette, just ready to go. And I go back and forth and I change the color up quite a bit. See, now this is really coming forward because it's darker. So let's put some darker shapes down into here. And again, I'm not using any sort of reference image. I am just painting. I'm just having fun with this. And these are things I like to do with my beginning students because they get so tight about things sometimes and they think that, oh, I've got to make the perfect painting. And I'm like, yeah, you're not going to do that for a while. Don't worry about it. Okay, so you see I'm getting darker now. It's not moving much, but see, I'm not going back and forth too much. Let's make another little darker tree right here. So this darker tree hopefully will look like it's coming in front of that guy behind him. You could still throw down some water blossoms if you want to where things are wet, and that's going to create a little bit more texture for you. And when I say water blossoms, when you put water into a wet area, into an area that's already wet, what it's going to do is that the pigment is going to be pushed aside. It creates a cauliflower effect, aka a blossoming effect. And the idea is to learn how to control that and do that on purpose. But usually what happens is you do it by accident. And people are all upset because like, oh, I ruined the painting. I'm like, no, you didn't. It makes it look like a watercolor. Do another little tree here. This guy needs a friend. He's got some problems. I'll do another little branch here. Do some little more shapes here. You know, it can be just about anything. And if you want to get rid of a hard edge, come back in and hit it with a little bit of water. Oh, by the way, I don't know if I said this earlier. I didn't. I am painting with everything flat on the table. Sometimes I paint at angles because I want gravity to move things. In this case, I did not. Let's make another little tree right here. This is drying on. The paper's mostly dry on the edge of the paper right now. And so at this point in time, I'm going to get hard edges, except when I come into this area. And I'm still using the smaller brush at this point in time. I don't need the bigger brush yet. I'm pretty much done with that. We're going to make this a little darker down here. And we still have some white back in here, but you're not going to see that until we peel off the masking fluid. Now what I could do is I feel like I didn't put any trees back in here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a lighter mixture of my colors. I might get a little bit of a harder edge in the background here. I will. But this is going to be a lighter value, so it's not going to read as coming forward as much. I'm just going to put some tree shapes right here. Then I'm going to hit this with water and kind of feather this edge out a little bit. Do the same thing over here, just make another little tree shape back there. I kind of lost this tree shape right at the top of the tree. Let's just make this guy come a little bit higher. And I'm starting to like what's going on here. I think this is looking okay. If I want to get some more individual detail in branches and things, I could come back up here while things are still, where they're starting to dry a little bit, and get some additional, details. Another thing I love to use when I paint, and I use this all the time, is a palette knife. I know people typically think a palette knife is for oil and acrylic painting, but it's actually quite good for watercolor painting, because what you can do, and this takes a little bit of practice, is I'm looking for a certain shine to the paper. If the paper is too shiny, if you use a palette knife and you dig into the paper, you're gonna make a dark mark, which is great if you wanna make a dark mark. But if you're trying to make like a lighter mark, what you can do is, the paper's not too wet. It's probably a little bit too wet right there. It's probably okay here. But what you can do is you can scratch the pigment aside to get back to the lighter part of the paper. And this is an amazing way to create simple details. And I have to turn this just a little sideways. I can't do this angle I was working on. And you can come into here and you can scratch. And as long as the paper's not too wet, the color won't fill itself in too much. So you see just a little bit of detailing. So you can scratch these details into this painting. The idea is not to try to do too much, so that's the hard part, because people get too overboard with it. And the idea is just to create a little bit of separation between certain subjects, certain areas, by simply just using a palette knife. You can also use your fingernail. I've seen people use credit cards or like hotel cards, those little white plastic cards they give you for hotels. Keep those, because those are good for this sort of thing. And now I'm just kind of analyzing how this looks a little bit. And there's a wasp in my studio. That's not good. I have to watch where the wasp is. Art is dangerous, everybody. All right, let's just take a quick look here. Scratch a little bit of white back into here. And while this is still wet, oh, if you want to, so we've got lots of wet areas down here. If you want to get some softer edges in the foreground, while that's wet, take your bigger brush again, mostly clean water. And what you could do is you could come into here and touch this while it's still a little damp. And you could bring this down into here. Because snow has, color, has reflections in it. Don't be afraid to put some color into it. And I could bring a little bit of this down into here. And you're gonna see this brown is creeping down into here now. That's okay though, I don't mind that. You can come up in here and soften this edge a little bit. Just hit that with some water, let that creep into there. And this is another reason why you would want to paint this flat, because if you tilt it at an angle, gravity's gonna move it whatever direction. And sometimes that's not what you want. Okay. I'm switching to the smaller brush again. I'm going to pretty thick paint, less water. And I'm gonna come up into here now and I'm gonna do some darker trees, and you're gonna see this isn't moving, the tree branches. And you're gonna see this stuff isn't moving very much, and that's because it's really thick paint. And that's gonna make that come forward even more. So I'll get some darker areas down at the bottom of the trees here. And people tell me you can't control watercolor. I'm like, oh, I disagree. Like literally there's a wasp flying all over this area. I'm kind of nervous. We've had some wasps in the building and they can't figure out where they're coming from. So they haven't been able to exterminate them yet. And I don't want to kill them because they're out, wasps out of their use, but not when you're trying to film a video. That'd be hilarious if it actually landed on the painting. All right, so I'm just putting down some darker color. And you see at the top now the paper's dry. And so we're definitely getting hard edges. up in this section. We could get another darker area in here. Now these guys I paint all at once. I mean, you could let things dry, then come back into it, but you're gonna get hard edges if you do that. All right, I'm gonna make another little, so I kind of lost, these trees kind of blended out a little bit on us, and these trees are kind of too equal like I was complaining about earlier. So we could very easily do here is I could come into here and I could put another little tree branch. So, or another tree, we could put this little tree here. We'll just do that little. Just break that shape up a little bit. And then, as I said, I lost these guys over here a little bit as the paper was drying on us. So let's come up into here and just do like this tree is kind of a dead tree. So again, some hard edges, some soft edges. Okay. Make this guy a little bit stronger too. And then go back to the palette knife while we still have the time to change things a little bit. Pull back those highlights a little bit. Okay, and I think that's pretty much what I'm gonna do with this painting. I'm gonna dry this now with my hair dryer. And actually one other thing I wanna do is I'm gonna take my brush with just a little bit of paint on it. And I'm gonna create just a little bit of a textural effect down here. So this is a dry brush technique where you're just dragging it across the top. You're just dragging your brush across the top of the surface sideways, and that creates that beautiful textural effect. And then if you want to put a couple grasses or things into there, they're sticking up through the snow. And again, we're not looking for patterns and things. Just little calligraphy marks. Bring it up there a little bit, make it just a little bit down here. And I am going to do one other little thing in here. Scratch a little back to white here, just to create some separation. Same thing here. And I'm going to let this dry, and then we're going to see how it looks. All right, I used a hair dryer on it, and it feels dry. If you feel the paper, use the back of your hand. If it feels cold to the touch, that means the paper is a little bit wet, so you want to continue to use the hair dryer because the next step I want to do is I want to remove the masking fluid. And you want to make sure that everything's 1000% dry before you do this, because if you don't and it's wet and you start to smear off the masking fluid, you're going to take wet color and smear it into your paper. And you especially don't do that in those beautiful white. You don't want to do that in those whites where you just preserved it. So you can use your fingers and get this stuff off. And I didn't put a lot of masking fluid down here, so I'm just going to use my fingers right now. And if you see color smearing, stop and just use the hair dryer and continue to dry it. And there's always some sections of masking fluid that you're going to miss. You think you got it all off, and you're going to put it into a frame a couple years later, and or next week. You're like, hey, what's that blue-green thing on the paint? And you're like, oh, it's still masking fluid. So just make sure you get all the mask off. So get this stuff off the paper here. And you can see the sky that looked really dark when we started is really lightened up quite a bit. And watercolor dries about 25 to 30% lighter sometimes. So and this does make the worst noise in the world. My next door neighbor, I knocked over. And this also moves the table quite a bit, so don't have your water too close. Because I've done this a few times where I'm getting all this stuff off, and the table's shaking, and my water's spilled over into here. Okay, so now we've got this nice little snow scene, which looks pretty good. You could almost call this finished at this point in time, but I want to show you a few other things. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a flat brush, and this is a 1/4 inch flat brush. Also, this is a Richeson brush, but it doesn't have a label on it anymore because of the handle. Everything rubbed off the handle. I'll put a little bit of water on the brush, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come back into here, I'm just gonna agitate some of these areas. So, you know, this works really well if your colors are non-staining, and I don't really know what I used in this painting because I was working from just the schmutz on the palette, but if you just go into here now and get the paint wet, you can lift off a little bit of it. And this is a great way to kind of go back, and if you lost some of your details, to kind of create the impression, sculpt back some details, the lifting of color. I love to lift off color. You don't have to take off too much. I'm trying to blend these edges so it's not too much. And just little shapes. I don't like what I did there. Just take off little spots of it. And it's a matter of just going back and forth sometimes, taking some sections off. Let's make a little bit of a lighter area here. See, I'm agitating the color. You could dab with a paper towel, but this paper towel has got a lot of stuff on it already. Don't dab with a dirty paper towel because that's just gonna grind the schmutz into your paper. I'll make a little bit of a lighter mark here. I do a lot of pulling out of color later on. Go back into here and pull out some spots. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a whole lot, really. A little bit of lifting and pulling out shapes. Sometimes I do this for hours, depends on what I'm working on. You can soften up some edges if it got a little bit too much of a hard edge there. Come back in and hit that edge a little bit, rinse the brush off and come back and lift off that color now to make that go into the background a little bit. Let's make that look a little bit more like pine tree shape. And you should have relatively clean water when you do this. It certainly would help the process. So I'm pulling off some shapes, putting some shapes down. Let's get back to some highlights in the background. Remember, it's a forest, so it doesn't have to be perfect. If you're working with foliage, just kind of want to remember that you don't want to do a lot of geometric shapes because geometric shapes renders architecture. I don't like that blob there. Take off some of this. So a lot of these colors are coming off pretty easily. And then the last thing I think I'm going to do, actually not the last, I lied. I don't like what happened here. Too much of this color crept out. It's kind of a big blob. So I'm going to come up into here. And I think flat brushes are really good for lifting off color because it activates and agitates more color than a round, for example, and I can get better lines with a flat as opposed to a round brush. But again, I've got the brushwork skills of Conan the Barbarian, so you got to find what works for you. Just gonna pull off a little bit of that so it's not such a big blob coming out. And then I'm gonna grab my Richeson number 6, which has a beautiful tip, and I'm gonna use pretty thick paint. I'm coming into here if you want to get a little bit more detailing. You could do some different marks. It's going to give you hard edges, of course, because the paper's all dry. It doesn't have to be too much, just a little bit there. Let's get some absolute black into a couple areas too. And the easiest way to make black, I mean, you can just purchase black, but as I've said already in this video demo, I would use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna because it's a very granulating dark black. That's probably what I use 90% of the time when I want to get absolute black into my paintings. But you just have to make sure that you're using enough paint. With the blacks, it's about more paint, less water. And be aware of your brush shapes. If you start to recreate the same shapes too much, try to get a variety of shapes. Just change it up a lot, and that makes it look more like real life. Some spots here. Let's go back up in here and make this a little bit darker. If I paint over some of the white spots by accident, that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to put a little bit more paint up into here. Let's make this guy come forward a little bit more. While things are still wet, if you want to get rid of a hard edge, just come back and let it with water. You can go back and lift out some of those shapes. Nice thing about burnt sienna ultramarine blue, using them for a black, is that they don't stain the paper. They're non-staining colors, so you can get them off the paper pretty easily. And I'm gonna do just a couple little darker marks here. We've got some grasses, let's have a little bit of variety. Things sticking out. You could put a fence into there too if you wanted to. That'd be pretty easy. Now I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a mixture of, kind of a mid-value mixture of some colors. I'm using pretty much everything. But I'm using kind of the same combination of colors over and over again. Just do a little bit of spattering into the foreground. And the final thing that I'm gonna do, you don't have to do this part's completely optional, is I don't use a lot of white paint when I paint, but if I do, I use titanium white, which is the thickest, most opaque white that you can get. It's PW6 is the pigment number, I believe, I hope. If not, I'll correct myself in the video. Put down, so I get a big thick mixture of this, and I don't want this really to go into the foreground. So this would be another way to make snowflakes at the very end if you didn't mask at the beginning and spatter. Now this is the same thing I did with masking fluid, but this is with white paint. And you can see it goes all over the place. So, you know, if you're sitting next to somebody in a class, you might want to move. Now, and when this dries, it's not going to, titanium white is never going to look as white as the paper. But it gives you different snowflake options. And I got to stand up and take a look at this. I think it looks pretty good. I think I'm done with this. I'm going to call it a, going to dry it, and I'm going to sign it and make sure that all the masking fluid's peeled off of it. So I would like to thank you for being part of this video demonstration. We didn't use that many colors. We basically just worked alla prima, wet into wet, let the paper dry the entire time, using different techniques: masking fluid, white paint, palette knives, lifting paint, putting it back down again. If you guys got any questions, leave them in the comments for the YouTube video. I'd be happy to answer them. If you like this content, hit subscribe. I'll have more watercolor tutorials in the future. Thanks a lot, and happy painting.